Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.
Hello, I'm Lorene Mills, and welcome to Report from Santa Fe. Our guest today is Gar Alperovitz. Am I saying it right?
You have. Perfect.
Perfect. I have admired you for so long. He's an economist and a historian. Welcome to Report from Santa Fe.
Thank you for having me.
Well, you are the Lionel Bauman Professor of Political Economy at the University of Maryland.
I've actually just retired from that, so I was until August. So.
Well, it's too long anyway. But you were fellows at King's College in Cambridge, a founding fellow of Harvard's Institute of Politics, a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. What also fascinates me is your legislative experience. You were legislative director in both the House and the Senate. And you worked as a special assistant in the Department of State, the
yes,
State Department.
My mother wondered if I'd ever get a job that I could keep.
Yeah. Well, this is why I'm so happy to have you here, because you bring such a wealth of experience, wisdom, and information. And you write a lot of articles, and let's just say you've been on with Charlie Rose and my God, Meet the Press, Larry King, O'Reilly, all of them, because your perspective on the economy is just extraordinary. Now, two more things. You work with the New Economics Initiative.
Yes.
And something called the Democracy Collaborative.
Yes, indeed.
So, talk to me.
Well, the Democracy Collaborative is my main home, and is one of the reasons I've moved from the university. And it's an institution that's really on the ground developing very significant scale worker cooperatives and community-based development of a very sophisticated kind that is community, neighborhoods, and cooperatives integrated. There's a big one in Cleveland we can talk about. And also, secondly, developing the theory of the next system. We call it the Next System Project. If you don't like capitalism, you don't like socialism, what is it you want? And how do we get a very serious dialogue about that as our country goes through this turmoil and in some ways decay? I think we're in a very difficult state.
You've written so many books. I only have some of the last two. America Beyond Capitalism, Reclaiming Our Wealth and Liberty and Our Democracy. This one is just so well reviewed. Your new one is What Then Must We Do? And what's the subtitle?
Yeah, it's, straight talk about the next American revolution, building a community-based economy from the bottom up.
Well, why are people nervous when they think about changing our economic system? It's changing without us doing anything.
Yeah, it's changing in directions that are hurting a lot of people, and it has been for 30 or 40 years. Many people think, and I'm certainly one of them, that we are in a period of great decay and pain and difficulty. Virtually all the major trends. And this is how you tell it a system problem from an ordinary garden variety political problem. If long trends of income inequality grow over 30, 40 years,
they have,
with different Republicans, Democrats in office, no matter what, if ecological trends decay, no matter what, give or take a little blip, if poverty decays, no matter what, 30-year trends, if the top 1% goes from 10% of the income to 22% of the income, over that time, you know that, again, doesn't matter who's in office, a little bit it matters, but the big trends tell you something deep is wrong, and we call that a systemic problem, that it's deep in the heart of corporate capitalism. And what we know about state socialism, it wasn't much better, to say the least. So we are into the question of where are we going, what's the long view, how do we build up a whole different understanding of where we want to go, and actually practical developments in that direction.
And it's interesting because it comes at us now from so many directions. We had the Occupy movement was saying the 1% income inequality, but talk about the man who founded the Davos conference.
The man who founded the Davos conference has said the same thing, that the problem is capitalism. And you can imagine. I was invited last summer to speak to the Academy of Management. That's 29,000 professors and corporate advisors. Now, they all don't come to the conference, but it's a huge conference, to give one of the keynotes. And the subject of their conference was, is capitalism over? Where are we going? So the idea that we may face a real problem of our entire system is really right around the edges. People just beginning to realize that that's the question. And then that poses the two questions. What would be better? And since the other alternatives are not very good. And secondly, how do we get from here to there? And those are the things that those books are about.
Well, one basic thing that we have to note in terms of Davos was that they've come to the conclusion that it's not an economic problem.
Yep.
Talk about our economy now.
Yeah, it's people. Often say this in lectures, that we don't have any economic problem at all. People look at me and they say, "Are you kidding?" And I say, "Well, look, the current economy produces about $200,000 for every family of four, even now, even in recession, even in decay. So we don't have an underlying economic problem. We have a political problem, managing the wealthiest economy in the history of the world. And that's what the name of the game is. How do you change the whole political economic structure, realizing that the resource base is extraordinary?
Now, before we come to that tantalizing question of what are the alternatives, I really, could you give us, as a historian, a perspective on the systems that have been running mankind culture from land-based systems? Because most of us just don't look at it in terms of that. The system that we're in now is just one of an evolutionary process of systems. So what was the first?
Well, it's a very good question. Well, the very first we don't know exactly, village-based, peasant-based, but usually systems, powerful political economic systems, revolve around, not surprisingly, who's got the money and who's got the capital and really the wealth, the deep wealth. So feudalism ran on who held the land, because that was how wealth was held. And the lords and the king and the church had the land and the peasants didn't. But the power, and this is the point, political power went with the wealth. 19th century capitalism in America, which was primarily competitive small business capitalism. People don't think about it. Farmers are small business capitalists, and that was the dominant reality of a system that was very different from what we now have, which is corporate capitalism, where the corporations and small elites, very tiny elites, own capital, and the political power goes that direction as well. State socialism, the state held the power, and in many ways, used it in a crushing way. So who gets to own capital, who gets to own wealth, is a really important element in any systemic vision. And I think that's one of the things that people are beginning to realize.
So one of the things you offer as a historian is that breadth of perspective, because we are talking about thousands of years. And these are changes that are not going to come about in an election or two. You talk about your heroes being the civil rights workers.
Yes.
And the suffragettes, the women in the 1880s. How long did it take them?
Well, it took them a long time, women particularly, in a decade. We're talking about the 1850s and the 1860s, and finally in 1918 getting the vote. I think we may move faster than that. But if you look at the civil rights movement, I sometimes say, is true, my heroes, and this is one way to think about social change, my heroes are people in the civil rights movement in the 1930s and 1940s, because they laid the groundwork upon which the 1960s was built. And I think we're in a similar place right now. People really don't quite realize, but all over the country, if you look closely and here in New Mexico, there are wonderful things going on the ground level that are suggesting a new direction, which I think as the pain deepens, and the pain is deepening, I think these things are going to be more and more developed and more distributed. There are many, many parts of the country where you're seeing public banks here, you're seeing worker-owned companies, you're seeing co-ops, you're seeing land trusts. In Boulder, Colorado, the city municipalized the electric power utility. There are 21 states that have introduced legislation for public banks. There's a whole development that the press has hardly covered, and it's coming out of both hope and vision, like those early civil rights workers, but also from pain and the difficulties that things just aren't working, and people really say we either try something different and begin to build in a new direction, or we have no direction. So I'm a pessimist in the short run. I think there's a great deal of pain, and it's going to grow deeper. But in part, that's creating a movement, or the prehistory. I sometimes use that term, the prehistory of the next great movement, the next great civil rights, feminist, environmental movement. So we have a shot. I'm a prudent optimist about the future.
So, in effect, you have just given us the answer to the question. If the question is, if not capitalism or state socialism, what is the alternative? And you're saying that there's a cooperative, worker base working in public banking, through credit unions, through co-ops, through neighborhood organizations. Or look at what Alaska does.
Exactly.
They give the oil money to every citizen.
Yeah, and there it is in so-called a very conservative state where the money is passed out as a matter of legal right from the ownership of wealth and oil to every citizen. I think last time I saw it was about $2,000, a little bit under $2,000 for a family of four at its peak. That would be $8,000. If you got three kids, it's $10,000 as a matter of legal right. So you see, if you look just below the surface, we're seeing many, many experiments and developments that you can build on that are very practical. I mean, I'm very interested in the Democracy Collaborative where I'm located. We're very interested in practical things, not theories and abstractions, but also point towards a different vision of where we're going.
Well, you point out that really couched in American traditions, there's a long pattern of this. When I was reading your book, I remembered about Youngstown, Ohio.
Yes.
What was that,
1977.
Tell what happened. That in one day, 5,000 workers lost their job.
Yeah, 5,000 people got pink slips in one day in September 1977. And that was a big deal then. That was front page news.
Yeah.
It happens all the time now. It's not news anymore. But in Youngstown, the steelworkers and an ecumenical coalition representing, the religious groups throughout the town, a steelworker had this idea, and they all joined in and said, why don't we take over the mill? And why don't we run it ourselves? Now, this is 1977, and I was called in to try to help them with the design of it, but the movement came out of this group. And in fact, they did develop a sophisticated design of how to do it, and they got big steel experts around the country to help them, and we got some funding to get the best of the best. And the Carter administration actually at that point agreed, with a lot of political pressure, to fund this worker community big steel mill with the loan guarantees of a couple $100 million. And then after the election of 1978, not surprisingly, somehow the money went away. But what was interesting, and this is the really interesting thing, the people who were doing that organizing, they knew about how politics works, that might happen, and they understood that their own responsibility was to educate people around the country, around the state, so that the next time around we could do it better. And in Ohio, and many parts of the country, there's something like 10,000 worker-owned companies around the country. Most people don't know that. But in Ohio, you find a lot of them that came from this fight. So in a sense, they lost the battle, but in a way, they won some of the war in that state. And we're seeing many, many more people interested now in worker co-ops and worker-owned companies and a whole different paradigm for one part of the economy.
Well, in Cleveland, there's the big greenhouse project, right?
Yes, Cleveland is another evolution in this because it's not only, maybe I'll say a word about it. It's not only the worker co-ops, very sophisticated kind. For instance, one of them is a greenhouse, the largest urban greenhouse in the United States. Not a small thing. It produces something like, last time I looked, 3 million heads of lettuce a year. It's not a small thing. And then there's a giant laundry, an industrial scale green laundry, and there's a solar installation. But they're linked together to support the community in a community-wide nonprofit. So it's all integrated, large scale. We're not talking about little things. And the big hospitals and universities have agreed to buy some from them to stabilize this worker complex of large-scale development. So it gives you an idea of where we could go with significant scale and strategy that takes us beyond smaller co-ops, though the smaller co-ops are critical. They are the ground zero that has to be built.
Well, we're speaking today with Gar Alperovitz. Thank you so much. You're talking about practical changes to the ownership of wealth. And we have to... everyone knows that right now this is a time of stagnation and stalemates, gridlock, and in a way social and economic decay. And it's kind of the change or die motif. People have felt the pain and they've adapted to it in all these ways. And it's true, there's not much in the press about this.
Yep.
But in so many communities, you mentioned Boulder just bought their utility company. It used to be called Public Utilities.
Yep, that's right.
Let's talk about the banks AIG, too big to fail, because that's one of the reasons it's been so painful for everyone that we had this economic meltdown.
Right. Well, several things are going on. And at one level, and I think the so-called new economy movement, which is kind of doing this all over the country and hasn't quite broken into the press. And someday, very soon, I think it's going to be discovered. Something's going on out there that hasn't been caught yet. It's been building up dramatically. At another level, I mean, the banking crisis tells you another kind of crisis story, which is essentially the U.S. government de facto nationalized those banks. Now, they didn't put that term out, and they nationalized AIG, which is the largest insurance company in the world,
and two huge automobile
companies. So I sometimes say, what do you do about in the next system as we emerge from the ground level up? Some things are much bigger than any one community that has co-ops and work. And probably some forms of public enterprise or takeover are going to be part of the mix because we know we've just done it. People say you can't nationalize companies. We just did it.
Well, we did it, but as soon as they started being profitable again, we gave them back.
That's right, we did. But what you see the sequence as they get into trouble. And I think, if you're viewing this as a historical process rather than a one-off, what I think is happening on the best of terms is we're building up understanding at the grassroots level that who owns is important. And that's a long process of co-ops and land trusts in Boulder, Colorado, and banks here in Santa Fe maybe become public banks. There's a whole movement that's slowly building up a different paradigm. That movement, I think, inevitably is going to have to ask questions about what do you do about big things and big banks and big companies. And I think they're going to see some part of that mix. During the 1930s, the notion of doing that was regionalized. We still have the Tennessee Valley Authority, which there it is, publicly owned, publicly managed, very large scale, and very popular in the region. So I think we're going to see these kinds of themes producing a mix that is not capitalism and not state socialism, but really American, very down home and very practical, but alters who gets to own things over time. So that's the hope. Now, we've got a lot of fights between here and there, but that is the developmental hope of the next system.
Well, you talk in your books about evolutionary reconstruction, and it's a slow process changing the paradigm. There are examples not only in America but around the world. Talk about Mondragon.
Yes, there are many examples, but I do want to emphasize the process that what's driving all this is failure and pain. And people don't do these things without a reason. And I think that's why there's reason to believe the changes are going. The very painful process. So what we've seen in Italy and in the Basque region of Spain, which is where the Mondragon cooperatives were built up, also out of great pain and over 50 years. It's about an 80,000 person complex of cooperatives, everything from supermarkets to building structures to medical equipment to high-tech development to engineering, you name it. They do lots of different things, very sophisticated. The ratio of income top to bottom in most of it is 5 or 6 to 1. Now, American corporations, it's 300 to 1.
Yeah.
At the top level of the Mondragon complex of very effective, highly efficient business development, it's 9 to 1. That's the top, not 300 to 1. So many people have taken hope from seeing that you can do large-scale things also in the new mix. And again, we're beginning to develop not only practical projects, many parts of the country that the press hasn't covered. We're beginning to see theoretical possibilities for larger scale. Now, I look at it as a historian and as an economist. These are preliminary steps laying groundwork both in practical realities, helping people now, developing new models, developing Cleveland models, developing banks, but they are laying groundwork for something that I think grows over time, potentially, as the pain grows. I'm not a utopian. This may go only nowhere, or it may go someplace. It's really going to be up to how the social movements that develop it and the serious engagement over time.
Well, in Spain in particular, it was against a backdrop of 25, 30% unemployment.
Yep.
And the people just had to do something. So, it's stimulus response.
That's
They chose to adapt and to create something new. And as we move toward this new economy, in your book, What Then Must We Do, I'm going to ask you, what then must we do? Because there are steps that the individual, I think the first thing is awareness.
Yes.
We have to be aware that things are changing, we're in flux, and a lot of people are suffering, and what are some new responses that are created? What do we need to be aware of as individuals and then as communities?
Well, the first thing is, I sometimes say we don't have a system problem. We have an existential problem. Now, what I mean by that, yeah, what I mean by that is most people have a vested interest in pessimism. Oh, nothing will ever work. Now, if you say that, you don't have to do anything. That's the personal existential question. I don't have to do anything. So people have to really ask themselves, look, historically we know the women's movement, the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, they all began in periods where people say, well, nothing like that is possible. And particularly the civil rights movement, they would hang you after they tortured you.
Yeah.
The question is, all right, are we going to personally begin to build on what we know can be done? And that's how you build a movement over time, rather than sort of stand back and naysay. We don't know how far we can go. But what we do know is you can make very important steps in any community, because it's being done all over the country. You can do it here. You are doing it here. Wonderful co-ops in Albuquerque and parts of New Mexico, for instance, as examples. And many parts of the country are doing things that move in a totally different direction. So then the question becomes, are you part of the action or are you part of the resistance? So I'm a measured kind of cautious optimist. As the pain grows, I think we can develop more of this. We will develop more of it. But it also comes down to whether people actually look at their own community and say, hey, if they can do it in Cleveland, or they can do it in Boulder, or if they can do it in Richmond, California, where things are going on, you can do it here.
Yeah. And we're moving toward public banking. We're moving toward the kind of venture capitalism where communities invest in new businesses. We've got incubators. We've got, there's a lot of things that we're doing in New Mexico.
Yes, the banking here in Santa Fe is very interesting development. Yeah.
So we'll watch and see. You're here, as a matter of fact, to speak to the Banking on New Mexico symposium. So one of the first things for people to be aware that there's a different way to do things, and Richard Wolff, who you know quite well, has always says, well, we're used to capitalism bringing us the goods, but now they're bringing us the bads, too.
That's a
and
good
to be aware of that and to just, look at what's working elsewhere. But are there things that an individual can do?
Well, the simplest things they've done, for instance, when the banks went down, people began personally shifting their money to co-op banks, credit unions.
Credit unions. And how much money are in credit unions?
We're talking about, credit union is a publicly owned cooperative bank. That's all it is. One person, one vote.
Yeah.
A bank, one person, one vote. And they're common as grass. There's $1 trillion in the co-op banks.
Yeah.
And you can, in some parts of the country, you can actually, any of them, you can get elected to the board if you're serious and ask how that money is being used. Some parts of the country, people are making campaigns to begin to shift the priorities of old standard kind of co-ops. So that's something you can do. You can buy from your local co-op, or here you can get involved in New Mexico. In many parts, they are very active in promoting economic development and community awareness and other programs. So they're using the co-op base, which some of them are very successful grocery co-ops, using that base to do development around the country in rural areas as well. Anybody can get involved in these entities, or you can begin to kind of, if you're really serious, start your own or get a group of people together. That's also happening. We run at the Democracy Collaborative. We were looking at these kind of things all over the country. There's a webpage which is called community-wealth.org, which kind of, you can find thousands of things on it. But I just read one today in North Carolina, the startup over the last 10 years of really interesting cooperatives in developing weaving and developing kind of new fabric designs and showing a way to do it. So this is happening, and I think it's partly a resistance problem and partly just getting the clue, hey, we can do this. Let's get off the chair and put it together. It's going to involve politics. It's going to involve tough politics. But the starting place is what is serious, what could we do that changes the paradigm, changes what we can do here, and then beginning also to build a politics around that reaches both to economics, to climate change, to the environment. That's the kind of movement that I think is slowly growing and part of the movement that anybody can get involved in.
How do you explain the resistance that some people have to all new ideas, but to this one in particular?
Well, we're finding, I think the resistance is primarily don't believe anything can be done against all that great power. I think that's what stops people. corporate power, the money in politics. What you need to do is stand back just a little bit in history and say, look, much more powerful systems have been transformed over time by citizen action. And I think the ones to think about, if you had lived in the South in the 1930s or 1940s, the system there was much more powerful if you were black.
Oh, yeah. They
would hang you after torturing you if you try to challenge it. And that's gone. That's gone. Feudalism is gone.
And so we see all these. We're almost out of time, but we are in a transition point, aren't we?
I think so.
And some of the other ones, we think of the transitions come the revolution, the Russian Revolution. That was very dramatic, but it's different now. It's more subtle, and people, an educated person can actually explore different options.
Yep. I think the term I've been using is that there's revolution, which is a violent change in ownership. Mm-hmm. And then there's reform, which allows the corporations to keep things. You try to clean it up around the edges. That's the one that's failing. The new form, I think, I call it evolutionary reconstruction. We're evolving co-ops and land trusts and municipal enterprise and a whole series of other things. We're evolving them and reconstructing the system from the bottom up. And that process, I think, is going to get political. And in many parts of the country, it is getting political. I think that building process, if you see it just a little bit beyond the first day of your life and see the next decade, you begin to think that, things begin to build. And who knows? It may be that nothing is possible. It's also certain that nothing is possible unless you begin working at it.
Yeah.
And other historical movements have, against very great odds, have triumphed. So I think the ball is in our court. It's not abstract. It's what are we going to do?
Right. Well, I'm on the side of possibility, and I'm so grateful. Our guest today is Gar Alperovitz. Thank you so much for joining us. Let me show, if our audience has been piqued by some of your ideas, this is What Then Must We Do. This is so clearly written. It's just very good. In America, Beyond Capitalism. And there's also a DVD if you don't want to sit around and read economic texts. This is called The Next American Revolution, crystal clear, plain talk. And it opened my mind to a lot of possibilities. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm Lorene Mills. I'd like to thank you, our audience, for being with us today on Report from Santa Fe. We'll see you next week.
Past archival programs of Report from Santa Fe are available at the website reportfromsantafe.com. If you have questions or comments, please email info@reportfromsantafe.com. Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.